Hi, I'm Nick Thomas and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. In this video we're going to be taking a first look at the new feather small swords. And this is a new, relatively new company. They've really got going in the last sort of few months, so it's a pandemic HEMA company, pandemic period, and they have released a standard sort of small sword, a few varieties of it. And also I've got here a couple of prototypes, which are the models without the knuckle bow, which are quite interesting. And so in this video, I'm going to take a opening look at these swords, both the completely standard one and the prototypes as well. Now, as a caveat, I haven't been able to actually fence with these yet because we sadly are still under lockdown conditions, which hopefully will change in the next few weeks. But right now, all I can do is give you first impressions. That said, these feather small swords use standard blades. So in this case, it's a PBT epee, and the other two I fitted with my own HFA, that's Historical Fence and Armory blades. So I feel that I can review this quite successfully without having used it because the blades are a known quantity, and the hilts are quite simple, and I think we can get a good review without even trying these out. So I'm going to compare them to some original swords, give you an idea of what I think of the specification. So small swords are one of those categories of swords that, to be honest, is not very well catered for. Is that they've over the years there've been kind of a few budget ugly options, like say the Leon Paul starter small sword. There've been some very expensive options and not a huge amount in between. And particularly if you live in Europe, I know in America you have got a few options for some budget component parts. And so enter this, the feather small sword. And I would say this is very much mid-range in price, although low end of mid-range. For me, with a small sword, I would say budget is under £100 as currency. Mid-range is kind of 1 to 200 and high range is 300 upwards. So these come in at right now €110 for the hilt, the complete hilt, or I think it is €130 right now with a PBT epee blade. And so it's the kind of towards the lower end of mid-range. And if you wanted to fit a musketeer blade onto this, obviously that would increase the cost a little bit, but you're still talking about, well shy of £200 for a complete sword. And so yeah, low end of mid-range. And instantly, I would say the quality is absolutely fantastic at that price point. So yeah, I'm going to do a direct comparison to the originals. So with small sword, some people like to have training swords that closely imitate the actual original small swords. Some people prefer things that look like a training foil. There's no right or wrong to it, but feather small swords have very much gone down the line of looking like a real small sword and not a training foil. Although not as a kind of exact sort of museum piece replica, because you can see there's the nut and the kind of the cut guards. They kind of imitate originals without looking to be a museum piece. So what you've got is a very, very pretty training sword, a very pretty modern training sword that embodies the originals without trying to be a museum sort of replica of one. Now, small swords, they vary quite a bit, but in the typical, what we would consider the kind of typical French form of small sword of the 18th century, they usually are in the range of about 350 to 450 grams total weight. And these feather small swords with the PBT epee blade come in at 380. In this order, we had 3 of these, and they're within 6 grams of one another, so they're very consistent, all around 380 grams. A 380 gram small sword is really typical for a French style small sword because they were popular in various countries. In Britain, for example, the French style small sword was the standard sort of typical small sword. And so yeah, you've got something that is really very typical. It uses I believe it's a size 2 epee blade, because the full modern sports epee blade for an adult is way too long to represent a typical small sword of this kind. So the blade is just under 83 centimeters, 32.5 inches to the shells. So that's quite typical. It's actually a whisker over the average length of 18th century small swords, which were surprisingly short. Around about 31 inch is actually really, really common, but there's plenty that range up to kind of 32 and 33. And so you've got something here with the épée blade as it's mounted that is really typical of representing an 18th century French style smallsword, and as I can show you here, for example. So this is a good example. This blade actually flares a little bit like a clichamard, which would be this. So this is the clichamard with the bottleneck sort of broad force on it, and this has basically a small element of that, a small flare. You wouldn't quite call it a clichamard, but it has a little bit of flare here. And so yeah, this is a 450 gram small sword with it's just under 32-inch blade. So this antique is just a whisker shy of the épée bladed feather small sword, and yeah, it's actually a little bit heavier, but that's because it has that flared blade. You will see significantly thinner small swords than this. You can easily drop a small sword antique wise down to about 300 grams, which is pretty damn low. But the range of small swords, as I said, is typically 350 to 450. There are some outliers below and above that, particularly when you get broader and different types of blade. So most small swords historically that we think of small swords have this triangular section blade, as an épée does. So historically speaking, it was actually foils that were used as training swords for small sword. So this would be used as the actual fighting weapon, a sharp version of this, or pointed version. And they would use a square blade, so a foil blade, as the practice for this. But generally speaking, most people prefer an épée today because our modern foils are a little bit more flexible, I would say, than a lot of the antiques are. And so people prefer the épée because it gives a bit more rigidity and therefore a slightly more realistic blade, while still having plenty of flex. And so yeah, the épée is preferred by most people. And then if we actually do a direct comparison of the two, you'll see that the rough size and shape is very, very similar of the pommel, of the quillen, of the anelets, which are these finger rings, not passed an, as sometimes they're called mistakenly. That's a mistake in various collectors' books. The block here, which covers the blade, which we would call would be called the core in French, the body in English, is really quite nicely done. So in small swords of this, again, of the French kind, you don't put the finger through like you would in, say, a typical rapier grip. We actually use a pinch grip on the core or the body, and that is all nice and smooth and comfortable to hold, and just braces into the grip really, really comfortably. Some small swords end up ridiculously large on the anelets, and that encourages people to put the finger through, which for this type of small sword we don't want to be doing. So they very much are for fashion and to just give space in front of the shell so that we can pinch grip it like this. And so the size is really very nice. In fact, you'll notice that the hilt is actually slightly smaller than this antique, particularly the space within the knuckle bow, the length of the grip and pommel. It's actually slightly smaller than my antique there. Now, with antiques, as you'll know if you watch this channel, there is immense variety. Even if you look at, say, a pattern of sword, you'll find immense variety, and these small swords do not conform to a pattern. So you will find that natural variety. I've only got 3 to show you here, and of course the small sword was a very, very common sword. But personally, I've got plenty of grip space in there. Small swords are usually used with sport fencing gloves or similar, which are quite slimline, so I think that should be fine for most people. The only caveat being here is that if you wanted to face heavier blades, so let's say you wanted to put small sword up against spadroon or sabre or broadsword, you would want a heavier glove, and that might be an issue for many heavier gloves. But that's something a bit more specialist, and not that many people do small sword against cutting blades. So that's something that isn't an issue for most people, because small sword usually only fences other small swords. That said, these open ones, that is one area they absolutely excel in, which we'll get to when I get to those blades in a moment. And so, what you have here is a small sword that is very, very realistic. It has the shells of the correct size, so they give the right amount of protection, not too much. The knuckle bow is nice and strong and well shaped. The anelets are well shaped. The core or body is a nice grip. The pommel is really nicely shaped. It balances at, let's have a look, measuring tape, Balances at 4.5 centimeters from the shells. So that's nimble without being too hilt heavy, I would say, and that's because they've gone with a really nice light pommel. Again, it's so common for small sword trainers and spadroons as well, and that kind of thing, to end up with excessively heavy pommels, and it just throws off the balance completely. You want a bit of blade presence because you want to be able to control people's blades. You don't want all the weight in the hand. And so, what do we have? We have as I said, very pretty HEMA training small sword that embodies the originals without trying to exactly copy them, that looks beautiful and is a really good price. I have no doubt that the durability is going to be excellent because, well, you look at the way it's been built, it's tough without being excessive in weight. You can tell that from the specifications I've given you. I would actually happily take this up against a lot of cutting swords. It's actually a lot tougher than most other small sword trainers that I've used or own. So it's tough, it's pretty. I know some people won't like the fact that there's a nut on there. Some people prefer a screw-threaded pommel. That's personal preference. For me, for a €110 hilt or €130 sword, I'm not at all bothered by that because that is a really beautiful piece of kit. The grip shape, I think it's very pretty. I wasn't quite sure of this bulbous section. Generally speaking, I prefer this bulbous section to be more in the center. Like, for example, this antique, which does bulge more uniformly in the center. Again, the guys that made these, they clearly use them a lot and do a lot of small sword fencing. So I think that's been done through practice and experience. And actually, in the hand, it does sit really nicely because once you get into a pinch grip, it does actually sit really, really nicely. So I wasn't sure what I was going to think of the grip shape, but I actually do quite like it. Okay, any negatives? Well, as I said, not everybody's going to like the nut on the end. I'm not really too bothered. It is after all a training sword. It's not trying to be a museum replica. I think the fit and finish is fantastic. It handles like a real small sword. And if you want to change the way it is in terms of blade length, rigidity, and anything else, you can just buy the hilt and mount it up with whatever you want, which is what I've done here. So that covers the standard small sword. They do a few different guard options that are slightly different shaped shells and things like that. That's very much personal preferences. It doesn't alter the sword significantly. So I think that covers most of their standard small swords. So what you're getting is a beautiful, complete, and very good training small sword. I absolutely love it. I think these are really going to quite dominate that mid price range of the small sword market, which there, quite frankly, isn't much in at the moment. Now, let's go to these. So when I was in the process of ordering these ones, so the 3 of those, and I will now state that we did get a few freebies here. So these 3 we paid for and we were in ordering anyway, and during the communication that we had with the company, they posted some photos to us of these basically prototype knuckle bowless small swords. And that was quite interesting to me, and really for 2 reasons. One, because I own an antique of that form. So most small swords did have a knuckle bow, but there was a sizable number that didn't. And it's really just a fashion thing. You don't really need a knuckle bow when you're doing thrust-only fencing. That said, a small sword might not always be fighting another small sword. But anyway, it's a fashion thing. It's simple, it's elegant, and it's understandable as to why somebody might like that design. And I've had this small sword for many, many years. It is a Kalishamard. It is definitely British because it's actually GR crown ciphered. So this is actually a soldier's small sword, which is quite unusual. And so when I saw the photos of this one, I was quite excited because, well, it looks almost identical to my antique, which there's no need to have them match to your antique, but personally, I'm a big fan of having training swords that accurately represent either antiques I own or I've handled or I've seen in museums, because to me, that takes it closer and closer to the real deal, okay? So it's not that this is unrealistic by any means. This is a very, very, very typical small sword. But this knuckle bolus one interested me, and it's two reasons, as I said. One is that I have that original, so it's a really close match to my original, which is very nice. And two, by not having a knuckle bow, you've got space for a big glove. One of the things that we love to do at the HF is mixed weapon sparring, and we love to pitch basically almost anything against anything, generally speaking, where the weapons would have met historically or likely could have. And for our purposes, that's basically everything that we train with. So yes, small swords did fight rapiers and sabers and spadroons and broadswords and that kind of thing, and so that's quite a fun concept. And so not only could I have something that looked like my original with this really elegant design, but also in terms of glove space, I can fit whatever I need to on this. So I can wear my 5-finger sparring glove, red dragons, anything else. And so that's quite a bonus. Now, if you're worried about protection with this, about the knuckle bow, I mean, put it this way, small sworders historically actually trained with foils. The figure of 8 foil was the most common training tool, realistically, for the most part, the only training tool that small sword fencers use to actually practice their small sword practice. And I've now actually made up some of those using some antique hilts. So I'm going to be doing some fencing using a kind of very realistic training foil. But as a result, they didn't have a knuckle bow, and they fenced all the time without a knuckle bow. So clearly it wasn't a big deal, but it is something to bear in mind. Now, I fitted a HFA, Historical Fencing Armory musketeer blade to this. The reason I did that is I am a big fan of both épée and the musketeer blades, and it's for a few reasons. Is that historically speaking, we know there was a huge spectrum of small swords. The épée blade does a really good job of representing the lighter end of the spectrum, and this musketeer blade, which is basically a fat épée, does a really good job of representing the heavier end of the spectrum. So for example, a substantial Kalishamard like this, well, it's 450 grams, despite the fact that the hilt is quite light. And another good example would be this small sword, which has a blade that we would call lenticular. So this small sword actually has a small amount of cutting ability. It's kind of in between a small sword and a spadroon. So yes, the small sword is a thrust-only sword, but there are examples that have some limited cutting ability. And that one actually comes out at over 500 grams, and the balance is quite far forward on it as well. And so when I put this blade onto this hilt, I wanted something that was robust, heavier, with much more blade presence. So this antique actually balances about 9 or 10 centimeters from the shells. It really does balance far forward, and that's because the hilt is light and the blade is quite substantial. And I've replicated it here. And so no, it's not a Kalishamard that I've fitted, but it has a good amount of mass, and as a result, this build that I've put together is a very, very close match to this one. It's about 15 grams lighter, maybe a bit less actually. It's very close, and the balance is nearly identical. And so what I've got here is a really robust small sword that will be excellent for facing off against cut and thrust swords, because it's got some mass to it, it's a lot stiffer than an épée, it's flexible enough. So again, when you hit people with this, you need to thrust as if you're thrusting, with a heavier blade. It bends more like a lot of rapiers do, whereas the épées are a lot softer. So personally, I'm fine with that. You'll have to check with your club. Some clubs are all about the épée blades, some like the musketeers, and some use both. We are happy to use both, as long as people are just treating them as they should, so not, going for excessively heavy thrusts when you're using these stiff blades. But inevitably, this company, Feather Small Sword, they didn't build this hilt for the musketeer blade, they built it for their épée blades. And so you could have this on an épée blade and it would be light and fast. It wouldn't be much different to this, it would just look a little bit different. But this is a great way to build one of those beefier small swords. So this comes out around about 430, maybe 435 grams, and feels really nice in the hand, really good blade presence, which is just like my Kalishamard there. Now, we got one more sword on the table, which is another of the open, so no quillen small swords. So yeah, they sent us these two for free. So we paid for the ones with the knuckle bows, we got these hilts for free, and then I mounted the blades up myself with current blades that I had. And they are two different versions. So this one has the open ring, so the anolets don't actually close back up to the body, they just stop there next to the shells, whereas this version has the closed rings, where the rings actually join back up to the body or core, and the shell sizes are also different, the pommels are slightly different. So these are slightly different hilts, and they wanted some feedback and some testing being done. I'm actually really happy with both of them. It's a hard choice, but the one thing you could say about having the joined up rings here is that is a good thing for fighting swords that are going to be cut in. And I'm sure the Feather Smallswords guys are probably looking at me in horror when I talk about using their swords against, broadswords and sabers. But, I think using smallsword against those weapons is important. It's something that did happen historically. It's something that is really fun to do. And I think when you've got a hilt that is 110 euros, risking it in those fights is not so bad compared to the rather weaker and more expensive small swords you often get on the market. So I don't feel too bad about that, and we will be doing some of those kinds of fights with them. Incidentally, I mounted a much longer blade on this one. So this is actually an 89 centimeter musketeer blade, and I did that purely as an interesting experiment. So yes, small swords are usually around about 31 inch, 32 inch blade length, something like that. But especially in the earlier period, let's say in the late 17th century, there were a lot of long-bladed small swords where basically things were transitioning from rapier to small sword. So this is a 35 inch from the shells, so it's pushing closer towards a rapier. And I just did it as an interesting experiment. And personally, I think it needs a little bit more hilt weight. Again, the Feather Smallswords guys, they didn't build this hilt to go on a very long musketeer blade, so that's on me. I think I'll add a little bit of weight, not much. I think it probably needs 20-30 grams, maybe a slightly heavier pommel, but that's an unusual build. But generally speaking, the standard small sword with épée blade I think is just excellent. It exactly works for what you want it to do as a small sword. It's pretty functional and realistic. If you mount that hilt or this one up with a 82 centimeter musketeer blade, you've got a really good heavier weight small sword, and I think there are some interesting options there. So Feather Smallswords from Serbia, they're new on the scene. They're just making small swords, although they've made a good variety of different small sword hilts, more than I can show you here because they've done a bit of other variety, mostly different kinds of shells. I'm very impressed. Now obviously we need to actually get them into sparring, and we will do that really, really soon. But so far I can tell you they look really good. They're clearly built really, really well. I can't question the build quality and clearly the strength of the hilts. That's very, very clear. And they do accurately represent the originals really, really nicely, whether you fit them with the épée blades or with a musketeer blade. And so already, before I've even used them, I can highly recommend them. And as we actually put them into sparring use, I will do a full review showing some footage and my opinion after we've put them through their paces thoroughly. But yeah, I think they're a really quite exciting company because small swords have not been well catered for, especially ones that look like an actual real small sword. And that shouldn't be underestimated. I know a lot of people in the small sword scene just say, well, just go to Leon Paul and buy some cheap parts, foil or épée, or mix the two, bung them together, and you've got a training sword. And whilst that is true, that absolutely works, it isn't very appealing to most people that either aren't already doing small sword or are sport fencers. So those two groups will happily do that. But most people that have come, or are possibly going to come to small sword from other sword-based interests, usually things like saber and broadsword and spadroon, having something that looks like a sword makes it far more appealing, and that's how we found we're already getting people into small sword in the AHF, whereas before it was a real challenge. Nobody ever bought, for example, the Leon Paul starter small sword because, okay, it was functional, but it looked rubbish. Whereas these, they really look beautiful, they look the part, and I can see them already being very popular, and I know a few of our members have already ordered them. So yeah, I'm already a big fan. Really, really like them, and I can't wait to put them to the test. So thanks for watching. Check out Feather Smallswords Facebook page, and please subscribe if you haven't already.